Revolutionary salutations to the people of Zimbabwe, comradely salutations to the suffering masses of our people. Welcome to yet another episode of the Tête-à-tête. My name is Comrade Ngobisi Mlambo, your host, co-host. I'm joined by Comrade Ostalos, a revolutionary intellectual, a leader, a thought leader in his own right. It's been long, fellow citizens, since we last recorded an episode of the Tête-à-tête. So firstly, apologies to the people of Zimbabwe, Comrade Ostalos, for taking too long. But good things come to those who wait. So before we get straight into the show, Comrade Ostalos, welcome to the show. Greet the people.
Thank you very much. Greetings, fellow Zimbabweans, fellow Africans, and the oppressed world over.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ostalos. So, fellow citizens, the last time we recorded a Tête-à-tête, over 8 months now. And a lot has happened in the political economy, in the macroeconomy, in the region, the SADC region, Comrade Ostalos, in Africa as a continent, but also globally. We see wars ravaging many parts of the world. The Middle East for decades has not been stable. Western Europe, Ukraine, Russia. We see wars in Africa, the DRC for decades has not been stable. We see Sudan, brothers fighting. So the crises are not only limited to Zimbabwe, Comrade Ostalos. The crises are regional in as much as they are continental and global. But before we talk about the continental crisis, the regional crisis, we want to talk about our country. The last time we met, there was no ZIG, for instance. We now have a ZIG as a currency. The last time we met, the macroeconomic conditions had not been this worse as they are in the motherland. So first things first, the first segment of the show is going to focus on the domestic aspects of our economy. The second component of the show, social service delivery. Right, so the first component, macroeconomic issues, the political economy. Second component, we are going to focus on social service delivery. The third component, we're going to go into the region, right? The SADC region. And we'll then go into the continent and then global politics. Then we propose recommendations, because remember, the Tête-à-tête, as we always say, is not a politically biased show in terms of a political party of any sorts, but it's a platform where we curate ideas, where we oppose and propose. Because as we're sharpened at the university, that we are supposed to critique police, not necessarily to focus on individuals. So, Comrade Ostalos, getting straight into the show, your analysis of the political economy as things stand.
Thank you very much, Brother Mlambo. Fellow Zimbabweans, Zimbabwe faces a serious crisis. That, in our view, and in my respectful view, start with the political crisis. Zimbabwean social contract is broken down, Brother Mlambo. Zimbabweans are now living outside the government. This is the abnormal nature of the situation in the country. People no longer expect anything from government. It's a sign of mistrust. To see this is how people are subcontracting the role of government, particularly in its public service delivery role.
Which will be our second component of the show.
You realize that, Brother Mlambo, because there is no longer trust between those who govern and those that are being governed. Therein lies the central crisis of our country, the crisis of illegitimacy, the crisis of misgovernance. The fact that Zimbabweans think that they can exist outside the state. Millions of people have left the country as economic and political refugees. People don't believe that anything can come out of the government. That's why people are now finding their own unique individual choices, what we call private solutions to public problems.
So when we said the social contract has literally been destroyed, finding private solutions to public problems, how do you link that to the economic crisis?
Thank you very much. So because of the fact that the social contract is broken down, the economy is the immediate casualty of the political problems. The first thing that the economy needs to survive, and I'll go specifically to the microeconomic instability facing our country, it is the politics stupid, they would say in political science circles. It is because there is no trust. An economy functions on the basis of confidence and trust. So when there is no trust now, it means that the currency that we have, you were talking about the ZiG. Do you know that since the launch of this currency called ZiG, this currency has lost more than 63% of its value. At the present moment, inflation is above 92%.
Yeah.
So you see that this is the problem because there is no trust. That is the first crisis that the economy.
So are you saying the challenges with the SIG initially are a trust issue? Before we talk about productivity, macroeconomic fundamentals, what is monetary policy, exchange rate problems, the ZiG, no one trusts the
because
ZiG.
the ZiG currency, Brother Mlambo,
Is it a currency?
reminds Zimbabweans.
Okay.
And I'll go to the mischaracterization of the economic crisis by the IMF
Yes.
in their recent interface with the Mr. Mnangagwa.
Yeah.
The ZiG faces the exact crisis that the Zimbabwean dollar faced when it absolutely collapsed. Me and you, at some stage when we were high school children, we became trillionaires.
Yes.
Because the Zimbabwean dollar had collapsed because of the multiple challenges that it faced. So when people see anything with the Zimbabwean bed, when people see anything that is Zimbabwe on monetary issues, they are reminded of 2008 when people were using wheelbarrows
Yes.
to go and purchase a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So the Zimbabwean currency at the present moment reminds Zimbabweans of the 2008 hyperinflationary environment and the crisis that Zimbabwean faced. So it was basically like a wife, Brother Mlambo, we
Yeah.
always say this, a wife or a husband.
Yeah.
So that
we are gender
I'm
sensitive.
gender sensitive.
Yes.
A wife and a husband caught in flagrante delicto.
The very act.
You are caught in the very act of doing it.
So there's no-
there is no explanation. Divorce is the natural consequence of the order of things. When you go to court and say, judge, your worship, as they say, the advocates,
Yeah.
they will say, judge, this one was caught in flagrante delicto, and therefore we propose a separation at law.
Even the good book.
Even the good book will allow it on that basis.
Yeah.
That trust is collapsed. So the Zimbabwean dollar faces the same predicament. There are those who are anti-intellectual and ahistoric about the economic situation in the country. They think that when we say that the Zimbabwean dollar at the present moment is not the solution, means that we are against the Zimbabwean dollar.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question. Are we against a monocurrency?
We are not against a monocurrency, Brother Mlambo.
Which is our own currency. not-
Because
Yeah.
the economic rules are simple. These are rules that took decades of scholars who are known as economists to invest in what should happen. We are saying that in the interim, because we have not dealt with our microeconomic fundamentals, we cannot have our own currency as a country at the present moment. But it doesn't mean that in the long term we can have our own currency. There are things that we must do, but they're not limited to the following. Number one, we must make sure that the microeconomic environment is stable.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Confidence must be there. At the present moment, the ZiG is no different from what they call the national fabric.
Yeah.
It is a political tool. It is a sign of slogans. An economy doesn't work on the base of slogans and some rituals that people would want to do in their own traditions. We have to deal first with that. Secondly, we have to industrialize.
Yeah.
We have to start producing, Brother Mlam. These rules were set centuries ago. They must ask their friends, the Chinese. They will tell you how they made the Chinese currency stable. They did not do so through rhetoric and nationalist rhetoric. They did so by making sure that they start producing. Look at the industry of China.
Now,
at the
China,
present
I
moment.
think globally, their share of global manufacturing is around 30%. So it means they produce 30% of global goods.
You get the point. So we need to produce. That's the important.
So Comrade Dostalos, on productivity, production, was you said confidence, one. Two, productivity, industrialization.
And of course, the gold currency. We must have reserves.
I mean, gold reserves. And we'll talk about illicit
not
financial flows.
that we saw from RBZ.
Yes.
Proper gold reserves.
Because remember, you when you were giving your remarks initially, you said the ZiG has lost 63% of its value since its introduction.
Correct.
It's called the Zimbabwe gold.
Yes.
And they said it's backed by gold. But during the period that the ZiG has lost its value, 63% of its
Gold
value.
value was growing
Gold
up.
prices were going
So
up.
that's the oxymoron.
Yeah, it's ironic.
Of Mthuli Ncube.
Yeah.
It shows the contradictions at the center of the RBZ. And that is why some of us believe at the present moment that the solution also includes a total overhaul of the central bank. Because it is one of the, if you read the report by the Ministry of Police, Home Affairs, if you read the report by the Auditor General, if you read the report by the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission by Justice Matanda Moyo, we lose, Brother Mlambo, 1.8 billion US dollars on illicit
gold
outflow
outflows
of gold alone. So it shows that the RBZ is central in the leakages that are happening on the economy. So that's why some of us propose that in the discourse about the future of a stable economy in the country, we must look at the issue around the role of the central bank.
Okay, so the currency has been caught in flagrante delicto, as you correctly said, to use your words. We need to be productive and we need to industrialize. The proposition is a developmental state, and a developmental state is all about industrialization. But someone might say, okay, how do you industrialize, Comrade Osalos? Where do we start from? What are the low-hanging fruits? Possibly, Bulawayo, we know Bulawayo is, the industrial hub of the country, Gweru, Mutare. How can we industrialize?
I think the solution is very clear, Brother Mlambo. We have, and we continue to stand on the proposition that Zimbabwe must industrialize. Africa must industrialize.
Yes.
The commitments that Africa makes in some of these international conferences is misinformed. Africa must go the route of industrialization.
As a continent.
As a continent. Because the solution at the end of the day are going to be African. The solutions are going to be continental. So in Zimbabwe, the same song, we must begin to a conversation about how do we industrialize. The first thing we must do, Bramla, is the question of the environment.
Okay.
For us to have a proper environment for investment to come in. Number two, the trajectory of industrialization is the trajectory of development. It must be led by the state.
Okay.
But it takes us back to the definition of the state.
What is the state?
Because the current state in its composition, its character, and its ideological inclination is not capable of industrialization.
Oh, so you need a capable state.
We need to have a capable state.
Mukanda will call it a capable
Which is the question about stewardship. So it's a question of leadership. So it takes us back that we need industrialized mindset, industrialists to be at the center of the discourse in this country.
Yeah.
What you see at the present moment is that our country doesn't have a governing philosophy. Because the governing philosophy guides the direction of the state. Forget the middle income economy, because it's a rhetoric.
The upper middle income economy.
I talked to one of vendors who's selling gas in Bulawayo, and I said, comrade, in an industrialized Zimbabwe, according to the 2030 strategy, they say that by 2030 you won't be there, you'll be replaced by machines. And I asked him, and his response was very simple, that my brother, 2030 is just 5 years from today.
That's true.
We won't even have reached even 25% of the proposition.
Yeah.
What do you see with that strategy, particularly driven by the Minister of Finance and the Treasurer? We are going to witness what is called ruthless economic growth, which is growth without equity.
Yes.
That's why some of us think that the current national question should be centered around the resolving the question of accountability and equity.
Yeah.
We are not going to be able to industrialize. We are not going to be able to develop our country unless we are serious about the conversation about accountability, one. Number two, if we are serious about the question of equity, we should not be having growth that is marked by the IMF and the World Bank, which is based on figures that know your economy is
growth.
It is quantitative, but growth must be both quantitative and qualitative. That is the purpose of social scientists.
What are your views on the IMF? Was it the IMF recently which said, no, we support the idea of Zimbabwe having its own currency, the ZiG becoming the sole currency of trade in the country? What are your views for Zimbabwe to get a staff monitoring program?
I think
ideologically, or how do you view the IMF, the World Bank, the international financial institutions and their history in the continent, how do you view it? Let's assume that you are in the state. How would you interface with the IMF?
I think that first is an indictment on ZANU-PF that purports to be a socialist movement and a political party founded on scientific Marxist-Leninist ideological standpoint. Because Mthuli Ncube is basically proposing that the solution to Zimbabwe, and it didn't start with Mthuli, by the way.
So it
started with no. Let's not go there. It started with Patrick Chinamasa.
Okay.
Patrick Chinamasa proposed that we are going to knock in the doors of the IMF and the World Bank. If they shut us down, we are going to continue knocking. Basically saying that a neoliberal approach is the only solution for Zimbabwe. And
yet the party, yet the party, as you correctly said, identifies as Marxist-Leninist.
And is actually then a confirmation that Mthuli Ncube is a resurrection of Chidzel.
Oh, that's where you were coming in.
You get the point?
Yes.
Because when we see Mthuli Ncube now, those of us who follow the working class struggles, and when the labor movement struggles were in their fever pitch in this country, it was them resisting IMF. That's why the banners were written IMF out. Because IMF is the one that left us in this current predicament.
Through ISAP.
Yeah. So Mthuli Ncube is taking us back to structural adjustment program at the BS of the IMF and the World Bank. And for us and the progressive within the state itself, those that are their fidelities to the liberation struggle must caution Mthuli Ncube and demand his immediate resignation, if not the entire cabal in Harar. Because they are an indictment to the founding ethos and the agenda and the ideological direction of the liberation project by saying that because the IMF and the World Bank are responsible for the chaos in the continent. Of course, that does not abrogate the crisis of the leadership that we've had in the
It's also a leadership choice to actually go to the IMF.
That is the double tragedy that our country faces, brother. Now, on one end with Robert Mugabe and his egos who say I'm moving out of the Commonwealth, I'm not going to pay the debt. Because if we go to the debate, brother, of the debt crisis,
we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that.
You will see why.
Let's deal with Mthuli Ncube's ideological concoctions and how it exposes the ruling party. Because I want you to hammer on that, because most people think that the ruling party is ideologically sound. It's a socialist party rooted in the people. Its policies are reflective of its ideology of Gutsa. So I want you to hammer more, because you're exposing the reality. TSP, Transitional Stabilization Program, was basically austerity for prosperity. The taxes that we see that are anti-poor and pro-business, tax havens, tax breaks for the politically exposed companies and entities. Those policies are not reflective of socialism. So what does it say about those who say that the ruling establishment is ideologically rooted in Pan-Africanism and the struggles of the poor? And they then say you are puppets of the West. People like Osalas are puppets of the West. They are neoliberal. The language you're putting across, I think, Brother Mlambo, is not neoliberal.
We have got the generational and an ideological responsibility as a generation to complete the unfinished business of the liberation struggle.
Which is Gutsa.
That's why we recast the democratic alternative in this country, not as an aberration, but a continuation and the only guarantor of the agenda of the liberation struggle.
The National Democratic Revolution.
The National Democratic Revolution can only attain its fulfillment and its objective, definitely not under the current misleadership that we see in Jongwe corner. Why? Because we are talking about the economy, but the economic conversation cannot happen without an understanding of political theory. So the conversation about solving this economic crisis starts with the conversation about where are we standing as a country ideologically. That's why you see Kwame Nkrumah came with Ujamaa. It was Nyerere, to be correct.
Yes.
It was about a governing philosophy, Brother Lamb. The conversation about Thomas Sankara starting to transform. What informed Thomas Sankara's proposition that we must plant trees in deserts? What informed Thomas Sankara's position and proposition that we must begin to produce domestically? it did not start with him looking for economic solutions to the troubled people of Upper Volta. That's why the first thing that Sankara did was to rename Upper Volta to Burkina Faso.
Yes.
That's philosophical. That's ideological, because Burkina Faso means the land of the upright people.
Yeah.
So it's a political philosophy standpoint that you must first answer. That's why some of us who, to a smaller extent, who recognize Robert Mugabe the late in terms of his contribution to African discourse. Forget his
on decolonization. Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, but broadly he was a twat.
The old dictator knew that you cannot be a ruling class without ruling ideas.
Yeah.
So that's why you see Robert Mugabe would visit the University of Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
He knew the role of academic. It's an indictment, because when you go to the University of Zimbabwe right now, lecturers are on strike. More than 40 days on strike now.
56 days.
In demand of living wages, Brother Mlambo. Whereas a serious country that wants to reach an upper middle-income economy by
invest in
must be
higher
education and institutions of higher learning to produce knowledge. Because you don't go there to government and sit in cabinet and make resolutions of more than 10 years impact in a country. There must be organic intellectuals who inform government, because Gramsci is very instructive in this proposition. Brother Mlambo, that the role of intellectuals is for them to be agents of class projects. What is a class project? It is the assumption that the National Democratic Revolution is a project for the oppressed. Who are the oppressed? The oppressed are the poor. Who are the poor? It is Zimbabweans, Africans, and the oppressed world over. So the assumption of the National Democratic Project is that intellectuals must inform the project of the poor to develop the masses. So you cannot talk about how we're going to develop without investing in production and reproduction of knowledge and easy testing, Brother Mlambo.
So you in essence, you can't industrialize. My namesake, the Minister of Industry, Mangaliso Ngobizita, he's always talking about industrialization, the strategy. But how do you talk about industrialization when your higher-end education counterpart as a minister is not taking seriously the crisis of the lecturers? Because as you correctly said, they are the bedrock. If you're talking about research and development, it is those academics that they use it, and anywhere in the country who are supposed to be motivated. And how do you motivate them? You pay them decent salary. You can't be a professor and earn $230.
And remember, Brother Mlambo, by paying lecturers and all working people, including teachers, nurses and doctors, a decent salary is not. We made commitments internationally and regionally. The International Labour Organization is very instructive, and we are part and parcel of some of these
like decent work
globally, that we are proposing and supporting decent work agenda, that we must give our workers a salary before the poverty datum line. But what is ironic, Brother Mlambo, is that you don't listen to the Minister of Industry when he addresses in boardrooms and in press conferences. You must look at the tone and the attitude of the political institutions and the leadership of the country. What is the political tone in this country? It is the weakness of Chivayo and the songs that are being given to these youngsters to sing. You get the point? It shows the attitude.
The level of consciousness or lack of it thereof.
That the sources of inspiration are people who must be answerable to the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. So the attitude tells you the story. So when you look at the type of cars that they drive, when you look at the houses that they own, when you look at the figures of corruption in the country, when you look at what's happening in mines and minerals in this country, it tells you the attitude of government. We gave a reference of Thomas Sankara. What type of a car did he drive? How much salary were given to government officials? Recently, we are talking about China. What is China's attitude towards corrupt people?
They kill.
In China, they hang. What do they do in Zimbabwe? Redeployment. You get another minister. You have looted in the Ministry of Health. People are complaining.
Recycling.
Go and loot in the Ministry.
We have a case of
Industry.
Priska Mfumira, who
Precisely the
the
point.
court said she's not mentally stable to stand trial. She was facing charges of corruption.
You get the point. If they realize
But
that
she's now a senator.
So
she's mentally sane to be a legislator, but not mentally sane to stand trial.
So when people don't trust these decisions, you then say Zimbabweans are not patriotic.
No.
That's why you see
Which comes to the next point on them suggesting that there should be a national ideological institute.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I think that the proposition that there must be an institution of ideology,
A national institute, what's that?
is an indictment and a very sad story from people who are ideologically bankrupt.
Yeah, who don't understand what
ideology means.
Yeah.
And that's why, Brother Mlambo, we must invest in the conversation.
Hence why we have the tête-à-tête
in this country.
Yes.
And I think that...
Can a nation have an ideology, or what's your comment on
the constitution of this country, Brother Mlambo, is very clear.
Yes.
Go and read the preamble.
Yeah.
And then read chapter 2 and chapter 2 read together.
Yeah.
They will define the character, content, and the direction and the values of our country. So you can't, Brother Lambo, legislate love. Because the proposition by these youngsters is that Zimbabwe must legislate patriotism. They must look at the simplest definition of patriotism anyway, even by the Chinese made and written dictionaries. Patriotism is a sense of belonging. You can't legalize it. You can't legislate it. You can't force someone to love you.
Yeah.
That's why even when people propose, you are not married, Brother Mla, but when you decide to do so, you know that you need to use the art of persuasion.
Yes, to a damsel.
Those of us who are in political leadership use superior logic to win over our competitors. We convince them through the force of logic. We don't use button sticks. We don't use the law to legislate. We must use superior ideas. The government must deliver. People must be patriotic. They must love the fruits.
Yes.
So you can't give people lemon and expect them to celebrate that we've given you pineapple.
Doesn't work.
It's a contradiction. It's also moronic.
So we don't need a national institute of ideology. A parliamentarian, I think from Chegutu, he raised that in parliament.
But if you look at their profile, it tells you the story.
Exactly. So we have dismissed that you can't legislate those things. You can't even, a party can have its own ideology. School is fine.
What we must do is let's implement the Zimbabwean constitution.
If we implement everything in the constitution,
once we implement the constitution, where
life will be happy. Life will be lekker.
Because it is instructive about what must happen on the role of parliament, the judiciary, and the legislature.
Thank you so much.
It's very
so let's move on in the interest of time. The issues are so many. Let's look at the public debt. You said Zimbabwe must industrialize, Comrade Dostalos, and industrialization needs money.
Precisely.
And most countries that have industrialized, they've used debt as an instrument to fund, industrialization. If we are serious about rapid industrialization, your countries like your China, your Singapore, your Taiwan, all these so-called Asian tigers, domestic capital markets were mature enough. For those who did not have mature domestic markets, they had access to cheap credit globally, right? So in Zimbabwe, already we have a debt crisis. 21 billion US dollars is what we owe according to the annual debt report produced by the government itself through the Public Debt Management Office. If we are in such a debt crisis and you're talking about industrialization, how do you juggle between debt justice, addressing the debt question, and our aspirations to industrialize? How do you link the two?
I think that the first thing that is needed, we must have a credible leadership in the country.
Yeah.
Because for us to resolve the Zimbabwean debt question, we need to have a credible leadership.
Okay.
That is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. A government that is credible. So the legitimacy question must be cured. The second thing that must happen is that the team that must resolve the debt, a team that must be set, take instruction from the Lima Agreement. Our negotiation team, because this debt we are going to need to renegotiate the debt. If you look at, of the 21 billion, Brother Mlambo, 13 billion of that money is external debt. 8 billion is domestic debt. Of the 13 billion, do you know that the real debt is about less than plus or minus 3 billion?
The principal amount, yes.
Because the other 9 billion,
10.9 billion
the
actually.
other 10.9 billion is actually
penalties.
money that comes from penalties and interests.
And the arrears.
You get the point.
Arrears, yeah.
Because Mugabe took money from the Bank of Brazil. One. Number two, we had a debt that we inherited from
700
Ian
million.
Smith.
Yeah.
Soon after independence, when we were negotiating in Lancaster House.
They failed to negotiate.
You get the point. And then secondly, and so the first thing we must do is that we must audit the debt. Who do we owe?
How much?
How was the debt accrued? Because like I said, you realize that the Bank of Brazil was used by Mugabe for his corrupt farm mechanization program. If you look at what Made was actually quoting some of the tractors.
Yeah, the former minister.
So the ordinary people did not benefit from the debt.
But they assumed the debt.
If you look at the other debt is from the Bank of England.
Yeah.
It's money also that one, not just from the Smith regime, but also money that Mugabe borrowed to buy Santanas to beat up people in the late
commercial rates. Yeah, that's
80s.
true. In the 60s, 96.
So when we have a proper audit of the debt, we know who do we owe. And some of
we know. So do you mean their debt or debts you're classifying as odious?
Of course, that's odious.
Illegitimate.
Debt. And therefore, in the renegotiation,
we mustn't pay it.
We mustn't pay that debt.
Yeah.
Because if you look at South Africa, also faced the same problem.
At Codesa.
With the debt borrowed from Louis Botha.
Yeah.
But it's ironic because that's why you need people who are going to be able to renegotiate the debt, because apartheid was a crime against humanity declared by the United Nations.
But they inherited apartheid.
So you cannot
Mandela
you get the point.
I wonder,
so we cannot be paying the Smith debt. That's why we need
the Mugabe debt.
Of course, their proposition about going through the HIPC route, highly indebted poor countries' debt, to look at the options of forgiveness. Some of us are very convinced that we must renegotiate the debt. Once we renegotiate the debt, because
and call for debt cancellation.
Yes, because without debt cancellation, we've limited fiscal space.
Yeah,
that is the
problem. Hence we can't industrialize.
And therefore we can't industrialize.
That's the point I wanted you to bring about that. If you are in a fiscal tight spot, you don't have enough fiscal legroom to spend. Because, for instance, you need. So there's what they call IDBZ.
Yes,
that bank was created during the Rhodesian era. What IDBZ used to do then was to fund domestic capitalists, domestic industrialists, to using cheap loans, what we call cheap money, cheap credit. But if you look at it now, is it capitalized fully? So that, but if it's not capitalized, how then do we industrialize? Because we can't access international finance, which is cheap, for us to industrialize.
Of course, you see that it will take us back to the hygiene politically. If we are able to close down the leakages, if you look at the last report from government, in terms of the money that they spend, it's about almost 500 billion, 500 something million. All that money was trying to service the debt. 53 million actually. So if it's 53 million, you realize that the problem with that, Brother Mlambo, is that Ntuli begin to overtax cities, which is the biggest crisis that we face, so that they pay the debt.
Which we are saying some of it is
fundamental issues. So that's why you are milking citizens. And that money does not go to where it's supposed to be going. Look at how much money is taken from all these levies. AIDS levy, tobacco levy,
carbon levy. If you buy fuel, there's a levy.
There's so many taxes.
Then VAT was increased.
And not only the question of taxation, but also the fact that there is no fair taxation in the country.
Where is Section 298 of the Constitution?
You get the point. It takes us back to the question of implementation of the Constitution. Because Section 293 is very clear about how the burden of tax must be shared.
Fair.
But the ordinary people now, Brother Lam, how do you explain that? An ordinary person is told to pay tax of having a solar geyser.
Yeah, that's what they're proposing,
house. But you've already paid tax when you're buying the geyser.
And the solar panel and the generator. You paid VAT.
Tax.
Yeah.
But now Mtuli says you must pay another tax, double taxation. But they're also giving tax break
to companies
that are
linked to them.
That's why people talk about taxing the rich.
Yeah.
You get
also, that's where taxing the rich comes
That's
into
why
play.
These other corrupt people are coming up with this. It's very sad. Because Zimbabweans don't look at deeper into these things. If you look at these teams that we see, Brother Mlam, the soccer teams that are emerging, people say we're now supporting this new team.
Yeah.
Those are instruments of tax evasions. You get the point? By the corrupt elites. They find these tax so that they are able to move
To cleanse the money.
But Zimbabweans look at things in their surface.
We need to dig
And
deeper.
and you see them wearing
That's the
this,
purpose of the
you get
Tête-à-tête.
the point.
Yes.
And that's why the Premier Soccer League, some of us now just go to support our own teams.
Sheila Moya is in trouble.
Because of our loyalty and fidelity to the team.
Impose.
But you know that is an entire
Yeah,
chaos.
it's a mess. Thanks so much, Comrade Rostalo. So we are talking about these things to demonstrate that we are not only opposing, but we are proposing.
Precisely.
That's the purpose of the Tête-à-tête. We're not only proposing, we are conscientizing. That's the purpose of this platform. It's not an interview.
Yeah.
It's a Tête-à-tête is a French word which means dialogue.
Yes.
One-on-one conversation.
Yes.
So some might be saying, is with the interview? Is Rostalo's thinking? No, it's about conversing. Because you and I, when we enrolled in the University of Zimbabwe in the year of Lord 2012,
Yes.
we joined the International Socialist Organization on campus.
Yes.
And the first thing we were taught in ISO was that you have to debate ideas.
Precisely.
And I think that's the purpose of this platform, because in Zimbabwe, there is no platform where people debate ideas week in and week out.
Precisely.
You can disagree with the Tête-à-tête, what we say ideologically. You cannot, but it must be on the purpose of ideas.
Precisely.
You
That's
get the point.
Purpose of
So
intellectual
just
discourse.
so that we make sure that there's nuance.
Yes.
It's not a personal attack on anyone.
Yes.
It's not an attack on an individual.
Yeah.
It's not supporting an individual. It's about the values, the ideas that we think can make Zimbabwe move forward,
100%.
and the transformation agenda around developmental states and stuff like. Moving on to social service delivery in the interest. I keep on saying in the interest of time, because we have a public health crisis.
Yeah.
With a public health crisis, I want you to speak to how can we transform the public health crisis. About what do we propose on the Tête-à-tête to address the public health crisis?
Thank you very much. I think just before I touch on the proposition,
Yeah.
I think we must unpack what's happening.
Yes, currently. Good.
In the social service sector. The public health system in this country has collapsed. And it has been witnessed by people from across religious, tribal, and political divides. Zimbabweans agree that ordinary people have no access to public health care infrastructure and support in this country. That's why you see people dying in our country. Look at the statistics on infant mortality rate.
Yeah.
They are very instructive about the crisis that we face. Visit Parenyatwa, Mpilo Hospital, Harare Hospital. It tells a story of a collapsed public health care system. And that's why Zimbabweans, I was reading a report that actually says that only 10% of Zimbabweans have health insurance. And 90% of the same population actually are investing in life insurance. They are preparing for their
Not
death.
necessarily life, but actually funeral cover, to be more precise.
To be more specific.
Yeah. We won't mention companies.
How do you have,
but
of course, if
Yeah.
you look at even most companies are investing in the same, very few are investing in the health of the
so
living.
just to quote you, so you said 10% are on
10%
medical
of the
aid,
people have medical aid.
but 90%
But
are
90%
on funeral policy.
cover. You get the point?
So-
So it means that 90% of the population is preparing to die. They are not preparing
Why?
to live.
Why?
It is because the public health care system has collapsed. It goes back to the question that I started with of a broken down social contract. People don't believe that the public health care system in this country is going to be better. That's why if you look at the spending in the public health care sector, it is what they call out-of-pocket spending.
Yes. Meaning citizens are
It
paying.
means that you go to Paris,
Yeah, you
you
have
are
to-
involved in an accident,
Yeah.
you have to fork out money, but that's not a sign of a stable society.
A caring.
Because you
State.
must go to hospital
Yeah.
to be treated.
Yes.
And the state must be able to say, the government and the governing philosophy must be that. That's why we talk about health for all. You get the point? Because you must be treated first, because health is important. Because when we talk about industrialization, it means that we need healthy people. How do you say this brongo taking and those young people that are taking drugs
Should
can
go to a
be
factory.
the people that can industrialize this country.
So-
So if you reject and not invest in the social service sector, you are not going to be able to reach the mid-income economy that you are proposing, because you need to industrialize. To industrialize, you need human resource capital.
Healthy population.
You get the point.
Yeah.
And it means your people must be healthy. So what we think, brother, if I am to go
a
to
proposition
the solution,
in the
because
interest
you
of
think
time.
that I lament, I join.
You're like in the extended book of Lamentations.
I join my good friend, Honorable Minister Machakairi,
Yes.
who joined the call and the lamenting by citizen journalists and other people like Jacob Ngari Vume and others, including the parliamentary portfolio on health that visited Paraniot and other hospitals, that lamented what citizens are saying in microblogging sites like Twitter and Facebook, that Paraniot has collapsed, that Harare hospital in Pilo has collapsed. It only took, and it's a contradiction, because I saw Machakari says that no,
there's a crisis.
Let's intervene in the health crisis, obviously, because it's relatives. Because it has to be closer home
for you to understand.
To realize, because you won't be able to airlift your relatives. If they're involved in an accident, you need rapid response on
ambulances,
the ground. And on those ambulances from Belarus will probably will be without fuel. And that's a debate for another day. But the contradiction is that the deputy minister now, which is the problem, you can't slogan here with problems in the country.
Oh, God.
The deputy minister then goes to issue a statement and say, no, there is no crisis. So once we are
but the deputy minister does not sit in cabinet. But Machakairi is a minister, sits in cabinet. So who should we believe?
No. Not only the question of belief is that in a normal country, that one I'll not name how I define and characterize him, but in a normal country they've resigned.
Yeah, that's true.
For bringing the name of the government
into disrepute.
Into disrepute.
Yeah, because he was lying.
Number two, for breaching his oath of office, because he lied before the people of Zimbabwe, who are the custodians and the people that the constitution serves.
Yeah.
You get the sense. But anyway, let's go to the solution. The solution, Brother Mlambo, is simple.
Yeah.
We must take lessons from South Africa.
Yeah.
We must take lessons from Rwanda recently.
Yeah.
We must have a national healthcare insurance for ordinary Zimbabweans. That is the solution.
Yeah.
All else is rhetoric. All else is futile. All else is drama. This country must have a national healthcare insurance for ordinary people, where an ordinary person will access health. So, and the question that will obviously come from regime troglodytes is that no, where are we going to fund that?
Yeah.
We talked about plugging leakages on illicit outflow of gold.
Yeah.
That's 1.8 billion annually that we lose.
Yeah.
If that money goes to health, not only that, Brandam.
Yeah.
Do you know that the AIDS levy produces millions of money that the treasury is not releasing to the Minister of Health?
And the National Health Council.
You get the point?
Yeah, the National Health Council is crying.
The National Health Council is not receiving its money.
But Treasury is taking.
So the Treasury is taking.
Whenever we buy airtime, there's a 3%, I think.
From every phone call that you make and every text message that you make.
Yeah.
When Zimbabweans are on Twitter, when they're on Facebook, there's a certain amount of money that is taken by the central government that must be going to the healthcare sector. Number 3.
So why are we in a crisis if we are taking millions?
The Abuja declaration that we are a party to is very instructive. That 15% of the national budget must go to health.
But we have missed that target for years.
So why should we invest in other ministries instead of investing in our own health? Because a wealthy nation is a healthy nation.
Thank you.
That is going to be the conversation about the future.
Thank you so much. So around a national health insurance scheme that covers everyone, that's the proposition. So that we end out of pocket expenditure on health.
Precisely.
Once everyone is covered, it means if you are sick, you can just walk into any institution of health, whether public or private, and be treated.
And when we are doing so, Brother Mlam, we are putting the constitution into
practice.
Because
progressively,
it talks about
Section
the right
76.
for Zimbabweans to have health.
Yes.
You get the point? It must not be health for the rich.
For
health for the men and not the few.
Thank you so much, Comrade Salos. Now, moving on into the region. Zimbabwean, social service delivery issues, there are many. But before we move into the region, your comment on the public transport system, the crisis that we see in a developmental state. What would a developmental state do for public transport?
I think that a developmental state that we propose is very instructive. That the first thing is that the state must lead development. Yeah. It means that the state must lead the process of building of roads. If you look at Harare Bulawayo, Harare, in fact, Bulawayo Victoria Falls Road, a road that leads to a tourist destination, is in a sorry state. But not only that, if you look at the road networks across the entire part of our country, the state must be the one leading the process of construction of roads in the country.
Public works.
And it must not be done in the current fashion. If you look at the reports that have come, the expose there on the recent, of course, we saw people that were celebrating the building, the construction of that interchange.
Yeah.
It's a very sad reality, because if you just cross on the south of Limpopo, you realize that this is a joke.
Yeah.
You get the point. But if you look at our economy in 1980,
we're the second most industrialized economy after South Africa. Yeah.
So for us now to be thinking that what is South Africa is impossible, is a historic, is disingenuous.
That's true.
For people who saw Zimbabwe in 1980 and South Africa, for people who saw China in 1980 and Zimbabwe,
that's true.
You get the point. China, we can't talk about China when we are talking about roads.
Yeah.
They are beyond. They are building roads
globally. In the global south, we know.
You get the point. But when they come here, they're just taking out lithium, which is why some of us obviously appreciate the progressive attempt to deal with the issue of exports of raw materials. We must protect our minerals. That's
value add.
Value add them here.
Create jobs.
That's why we talked about an African solution
to the problem.
Because when we have said, because it must not just be a Zimbabwean issue. That's why we need a continental economy and integration. Because the industrialization agenda we're talking about, the development of Zimbabwe cannot happen without the development of Zambia.
Of Mozambique.
The development of Zimbabwe cannot happen without the development of Mozambique.
That's true.
Because we will then be able to say, Botswana is going to be able to focus on the polishing of diamonds. We're not going to be importing cars, but South Africa has got the capacity.
Morocco already is exporting cars to Europe.
Precisely the point.
But it's in Africa.
The locomotives industry can be revived in the entire continent.
That's true. And
not only just for the purpose of production, but also for the purpose of regional and continental trade. When we put into practice the song that says from Morocco to Madagascar, you get the point. From Cape to Cairo. You get the point.
You are now reminding me of
you get
comedy shows. Yes.
When we put it into practice, it's not just a song, it's a socialization of an industrial agenda that we must have continental trade that look at Africans as a whole hub. Because what is the capacity of Africa in terms of its economy? Trillions of dollars.
If we integrate, we are a giant.
Then at that moment, we are going to be able to compete globally.
So if Zimbabwe says lithium, we add value to the lithium, we have a plant that produces lithium batteries. Then South Africa has the capacity to produce the buses.
Precisely.
They buy the lithium batteries from Zimbabwe, produce electric buses, they export them on the continent. We improve our public transport system, right? I mean,
we
45
talk
years
about
after
intelligent people. So a service economy in the continent will need people who are proper upstairs. And Zimbabwe was once celebrated globally for its capacity to produce intellectuals. If you look at how many Zimbabweans are different,
doing wonders.
You get the point. Parts of the globe.
But focusing on the SADC region in the interest of time.
Yes.
In the interest of time. I mean, a lot of developments have happened since we last recorded the Tête-à-tête. We sent Josie. The last time we recorded was in the EFF. It's no longer in the EFF. Nico Floyd Shivambu was in the EFF, was at some point became Secretary General of Mkondo Esizwe. So a lot is happening in SADC. The passing of former President Lungu, whom we salute for relinquishing power when he lost the election. For that we respect him, that there should be a smooth transfer of power. But the dynamics in the region, the last time we did a Tête-à-tête, the election in South Africa had not been done. And the ANC has lost its majority. They have a concussion, a government of national unity. DRC war crisis. What are your comments on overall the politics in the region, the happenings in the region, the tariffs by Trump on countries in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Lesotho and stuff?
I think that what's happening in the region and the continent, I think is very instructive of the following. One, I think that is clear. We've always argued, it qualifies the point that the liberation movements are reaching sunset. And progressive liberation movements ought to invest in those that are going to take the baton stick into the future. The liberation movement brought independence.
political independence.
Those of us who are going to take over the reins of political
Yes.
authority to govern differently and better for the progress of the continent must be able to be investing in the conversations. Liberation heroes must be writing books now, so that there is intergenerational transfer of knowledge and ethos and values and objectives of the liberation projects in the continent. That's why people like Mbeki are seen to be in the paths of progress for the continent, to begin to educate and share what were the conversations of the liberation project, what were the intentions, what was the agenda of the National Democratic Revolution. Because it is not possible for those that liberated Africa to transform it economically. You get the point. So it is also an instruction to those that must take over to understand that young people must open the future.
Yes.
Our generation must not allow the present to hold our future in suffocation, because it is the future of the unborn.
Yes.
We must not be thinking about us now.
Yes.
The conversation must be about the unborn.
Yes.
So I think that as South Africa faces its own internal contradictions in its body politic, the conversation is about how do we foster intergenerational conversation and ready younger people to take off. If you look at the dynamism in South African parliament now, by other young people
Thanks
like
to the
Sikelonzi
EFF,
and others. Of course, the EFF does very progressive in grooming and grounding younger people. So I think that it is very important. And like you say, to also send our solidarity to, and of course, the word of acknowledgement of the efforts by liberation heroes in the continent, and to celebrate the life of Lungu in terms of his acceptance to ascend to power and so forth, and sends our solidarity to the people of Zambia. They mourn him and figure out how they manage their own internal contradictions, which is the natural happening of politics. People are going to agree every day. It's not a new thing, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's how these leaders are going to be resolving the contradictions. But in the same respect, there is a crisis in Tanzania. The progressive comrades in the progressive opposition, like Tundu Lissu, are in prison. It is only natural for us in the progressive politics in the continent to send our solidarity to the opposition movement. It's an indictment to the feminist struggles when a female president. Some of us were convinced by the feminist narrative that women must lead in the time of crisis. But the experience by the female leader in Tanzania, it does
shows
more
that
harm.
is beyond the gender issue.
You get the point.
It's fundamental.
That's why principles and values are
very,
important,
very important,
regardless of gender.
So
tribe,
what would you say to President Kikwete if he's to watch the show?
I think that we will say to Kikwete, you must do what you did when we had a crisis in this country. President Kikwete must be able to fly in to Tanzania and remind the Tanzanian leader that democracy is the only sustainable form of governing. And when we talk about democracy in the African continent, it's not Western. We're not talking about neoliberalism. We're not talking about the Washington consensus or Margaret Thatcher. We are talking about the universal suffrage. The right for black people to choose leaders of their choice. So Tundu Lissu can't be in prison when Tanzanians are reaching a moment to choose leaders, because it means this is an insult to why people died in the liberation.
It's an insult to Nyerere himself, Mwalimu,
Samora Machel, when he said when bullets begin to fly, the struggle in Zimbabwe is our struggle. He was talking about the solidarity of Africans. That's why Nkrumah will say the liberation
of Ghana
is not complete without the liberation of the African continent. That is why the conversation now of the progressive left and the progressive social democrats like ourselves, it must be about convening at the present, but the world is in a crisis. You get the point? So the progressive social democrats and the progressive left at the moment must be reconvening, just like the Liberation Project convened in the non-aligned movement in the instructive historical experiences, so that we protect the future and save the future of the unborn.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ostalos. I think I'll end here for today. We still had a lot of issues to talk about, but we'll save that for the next episode in the interest of time. Conscious of the data costs for people, they might want to view the entire show, but if it's too long, You know, we're always talking about democratization of the
Yes,
internet.
yes.
And recently, the Minister of ICT was saying, no, we're going to put data centers and Wi-Fi spots in the country. So we're wait to
In
see.
a progressive Zimbabwe, those are going to be returned back to acting.
Yes.
We are going to be serious about Brother Mlambo wanting to run a country. So we say each according to their abilities. You're well trained in Studio 263.
Be an actor.
Who develop and put
We have
lot
a
of
James Manyika.
a lot of TV stations.
Yes.
Who open a Trevor Ngube's cries for a new TV station and allow them to go and entertain our people
Allow
while we
James
take this
Manyika to
serious
come and
business.
contribute to ICT.
And allow progressive
Allow
people to come
Agumtambara to come and
precisely the
contribute
point.
to
They've written
robotics,
books on
mechatronics,
AI.
and stuff like that.
So why shouldn't they come?
In a
So the
developmental
future of
state.
this country is going to be based on not just
capable
stewardship,
state, yeah.
but also issue of competence.
Competence-based leadership.
You get the point.
Yes.
We're not going to be looking at slogans as a way to go to parliament.
Thank you very
must
much,
be-
fellow citizens, for tuning in into yet another exciting episode of the Tête-à-tête. We appreciate your patience, your resilience, and your feedback as always. So please do send in your comments. We welcome those who do not agree with us more in terms of the ideas that we are sharing, that we need a developmental state, as Comrade Rostalos was saying. And those who agree with us, we also equally welcome them. But we challenge young people in this country to read, to take time to listen to the Tête-à-tête, to read, to shape themselves ideologically. And we stand in solidarity, as we always say, with everyone who is fighting for social justice.
Precisely, the young people in Kenya.
And the young people of Kenya who are fighting for social justice, for democracy and human rights. We stand in solidarity with those who are fighting against inequality. Right? We stand in solidarity with those who are fighting against imperialism in its various shapes, forms, and sizes. We stand in solidarity with those who are fighting dictatorships all over the world. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, Comrade Dostalos, as we continue from where we left. We start from the continental and focus on tariffs by Trump, geopolitics, the threats to the unipolar world system, to the unipolar world system. Maybe we're heading towards a multipolar world system. Maybe another unipolar world system led by China.
Precisely.
Because China is a fact. We cannot afford to ignore it. Better is not good enough. The best is yet to come. Thank you very much.